Thank you all, and thank you all for coming out this morning. And it's lovely to be here, and actually my day has already been a great success. Because coming down from Manhattan, I spent an hour in a taxi with a very delightful taxi driver. And when he discovered I was coming to a church, he couldn't be shaken from the belief that I was a pastor. I did make several attempts to explain, he wasn't having it. At the end of our journey, he asked me to give him a blessing, so I did oblige. No, I'm not often asked for a blessing, so I thought that was a good start. I should just to make things clear, say that I am an Episcopalian. I'm an Anglican in British talk, which means that I am very much brought up in a Protestant tradition. And have a great deal of sympathy and affection for Martin Luther and the Lutheran tradition he started. Very complicated man. On the whole, my book Brand Luther has been well reviewed, but it got a bit of a pasting from someone from the Missouri Synod, who wrote a review which was of two books, mine, that he passed over lightly because he really wanted to get his teeth into the other one. And the remark he made after explaining all my errors, he said, "And Pettegree is not even a Lutheran." And I don't know if he thought that was a disqualification from writing history, but anyway, he then turned his fire on someone who was a Lutheran, who should have known better for whatever they were doing. Well, I thought I would just tell you how I came to write the book, which I published on Luther, called Brand Luther. It was back in 2011 that I received, rather out of the blue, a letter from someone I hadn't met at Penguin USA, who wanted me to write a book called 1517. And put your first slide up front, David, that would be kind. What I think he had in mind was this: a very successful book called James Shapiro, who wrote a book called 1599, which sold a zillion copies. I think Scott thought we could do the same with the Reformation. Now, I wanted to write a book for Penguin, but I didn't want to write this book, because actually nothing happens in 1517. Luther doesn't post the theses up until the end of October, and it's one of the dullest years in European history. So what I did was I pitched this to him, because I thought this would unite my two great interests in my professional life. And one is the Reformation, which I worked on for about 15 years, and then I've really worked on the culture of, on the history of communication, on the shift from manuscript to printing in the 15th century. And he thought, okay, that's a good idea. And I gave him the script in 2014, a little bit early, thinking that I'd have time for a revision and so on. But by that point, he'd had a change of heart. He said, by the time we got to 2014, we were so bored of the First World War, because everyone had written so much about it, that the same is going to be true of 2017. We'll be so bored by the time we get there. So instead of giving it back for me to revise, he ended up just basically publishing it then. So it came out in 2015. So it was a bit of a rush job. So what I'm going to try and talk to you about today is why Luther became a media phenomenon. How was it that, if we go on to the next slide, a man who, here's the first portrait of him. How was it that a man who, until he was in his 30s, which is quite an advanced age by the standards of the 16th century, had published nothing? How could he discover a real talent for writing? Are we all right? Now, the improbability that someone who had not published anything till the year before the Reformation could become a best-selling author is one of a multitude of improbabilities which saved the Reformation. Martin Luther is one of the most talented men in history, but he's also one of the luckiest. The fact that he could discover this talent for writing, the fact that he survived. When Luther went across Germany to the Diet of Worms in 1521, he didn't expect to come home alive. expected to be executed. And that he'd reached this point at all was because of the protection of his local ruler, Frederick the Wise, who was a devout Catholic and remained so throughout his life. The man who protected Luther had one of the biggest collections of relics in Europe. And most of all, if we go to the next slide, the sheer improbability that anything of any significance could come from this little place, Wittenberg. Now, when Luther moved to Wittenberg, he wasn't impressed. He wrote later that he thought that he reached the edge of civilization. If he'd gone another 50 miles further north, it would have been in the middle of the barbarians. Other visitors were equally scathing, and here I'll quote one to you. This is an early critic of Luther, so he didn't mince his words. Wittenberg, he said, was a miserable, poor, dirty village, hardly worth 3 farthings. In fact, it's not worthy to be called a town in Germany. It has an unhealthy, disagreeable climate. It's without vineyards, orchards, or fruit-bearing trees of any kind. Dirty homes, unclean alleys, all roads, paths, and streets are full of filth. It has a barbarous people who make their living from breweries and saloons, and a body of merchants not worth 3 cents. It's not kind. On we go. Next slide. This is Duke George of Saxony, who is an enemy of Luther's great patron Frederick the Wise. And this is what he said. It's quite succinct. That a single monk out of such a hole could undertake a reformation is not to be tolerated. Indeed, one of the reasons the papacy might have been so slow to react to Luther is they simply couldn't anticipate anything of importance coming from a place like Wittenberg. So what we're going to do is we're trying to discern how Wittenberg could spark such a big movement and how Luther could be its instrument. But before that, we have to go to one other part. And that is this. Luther's Reformation succeeds through printed books. But the fact that print succeeded was not itself foreordained. Now we think of our world as one marked with great transformations in technology. From manuscript to print, from print to digital. And one of the great fortunes of my professional life has been writing about the transition from manuscript to print in this age, because the comparisons are so obvious that people always want to make them. But the fact that print succeeded was by no means as obvious as people would think. Now I'm going to ask you to just go through a little stream of, that's Gutenberg's Bible, by the way, that's one of the first books. One of the interesting things about this, you can see, is it's only half a book, because the initial letters are all put in by hand, because they hadn't really worked out how to do that yet. On we go, please. And on we go. Right, what I'm going to take you through is a series of slides which shows the development of printing in this period. And this is where it starts, up in Germany, and it spreads to Italy very quickly. And on. And then what happens is, this is a sort of spine, which is where most of the printing presses will be. Now, the customary narrative of print emphasizes how far and wide it spreads. That it spreads to England, to Spain, to northern Germany, to France very quickly. But that's actually very misleading, because if we roll through these slides, you'll see that most of the print output of Europe is actually concentrated within about 50 miles either side of the Rhine and in North Italy. On we go. So it's getting busier, and on we go. And what you'll see is these little spots out here will come and go. Because at the first age of print, everyone wanted a print shop. It was a must thing have. It was a must-have thing for any prince, any bishop, any town. But the problem was they were thinking of the model of manuscripts. Really, a manuscript can be penned anywhere. But what you need for printing to succeed is critical mass and finance. On we go. And on we go. And there you see these big mega centres, Venice, Paris, building up. But it's not really spread out at all. What's happened is that most of the early print shops grow very slowly and go bankrupt. Although there were 200 places which had print in this era, 2/3 of all the printing before 1500 were in just 12 places. And they were 12 places dotted around here. Now this is really a geography that should have had no place for Wittenberg. Wittenberg, by the way, is popped away somewhere up there. It's really got no, it's a long way from the communication nexus of Europe. It's got Leipzig very close, so it's already got a bigger printing centre nearby. And this is exactly how it was. There's no printing at all in the 15th century. Printing comes to Wittenberg in 1502, and if we go on, and this is the sort of quality of work you're getting from Wittenberg. This is the sort of work you get in 1470 elsewhere in Europe, right at the very beginning of printing. And here we're at 1508, and they're still taking their sort of first baby steps. 5 printers come and go before Luther starts to write. And that's because there's no money to be made in a little place like this. Basically all the works that they needed could come from Erfurt or Leipzig, which were very close. But now let's look at the Luther effect. Between 1502 and 1516, just before the Reformation, 5 printers printed a total of 123 books, which is about an average of 9 a year, and most of them were tiny, 8 pages like this. Between 1517 and 1546, Wittenberg's publishers turned out a total of 2,721 works. That is about 90 a year, and it's a 10-fold increase. And here we have, this is a slide from the resource that Jennifer mentioned, the Universal Short Title Catalogue, and it's the resource I've been creating with my students in St Andrews. The idea is it's meant to be a survey of all the books printed everywhere in the first 150 years of print. And it's taken us about 20 years to put it together, but now we have it. It actually turns out to be very interesting and very useful. Now, this vast blossoming of what was a new industry in Wittenberg was entirely the consequence of Martin Luther. 1 in 3 of all the books published during these 3 decades were Luther's own works. And another 20% of them were those of his colleagues in the Wittenberg church. So this is all down to the Reformation. So thanks to its favourite son, Wittenberg had sort of broken the iron economics of printing, which dictated that it could only succeed in very big places. Wittenberg had about 2,000 inhabitants at this point. A big city in Europe at that time would have had 100,000. The second smallest major city of printing had 30,000. That is, over 10 times as many inhabitants. So it's really exceptional that it could happen here. Well, as we all by now should know, Luther's first came to prominence through publishing these 95 theses against indulgences. Now, until that point, he built a decent career as a respected member of his own Augustinian order, but he was scarcely known outside these circles. Now, we know this because of an extraordinary document which turned up almost during the point I was writing this book. And one of the great things about writing a book is you delve into archives and you find some very, very strange things. And this is a manuscript, not a book, but just a handwritten document, which seems to be associated with a student recruitment campaign for the 3 universities in northeastern Germany, Leipzig, Frankfurt under Oder and Wittenberg. And it has a list with biographies of the top 100 professors from these 3 universities. Now, these weren't the best universities in Europe, but even in this relatively undistinguished company, there was no place in the top 100 for Wittenberg's professor of biblical theology, one Martin Luther. He didn't even make top 100. Now, the reason was that he published nothing. There were no publications to associate with him. Now, he first published his book in 1516, but it's really the theses that gain him notoriety. Now, people know that when he published these theses, they produced a tremendous counter-attack in the Catholic Church. But they know that he was attacking a hugely important institution, a cornerstone of popular devotion, and also a mainstay of the church economy. What happens is that in order to secure the soul of your departed family or yourself in prospect, that you make a generous donation to the church, and in return you receive this, which is an indulgence certificate. Now, most of the ones that survive are actually like this, unfilled in, because they survive because they were the remainder of stock. And here there's a room for both the name and the size of the donation, and then this gets left with your papers. I think the reason we don't have many filled in is because they haven't been preserved, because they lose their value once you die. Now, he was attacking the church, and he was attacking the economy of the church, but he was also attacking the print industry, because doing things like this for the church was one of the most lucrative jobs a printer could have, because the quantities required were huge. We have contracts remaining for the sale of 100,000, even 200,000, for the printing of 100,000, 200,000 of these certificates. So every printer wanted to do this. And this is from the indulgence campaign of 1515, the one that Luther was attacking. And we found examples of all the major printers in Nuremberg, Augsburg, Strasbourg, including people who 2 years later were printing for Martin Luther. So first they print indulgences, then they print Luther's attack on indulgences. As you know, there's no room for sentiment in commerce, and they certainly prove that. So Luther took aim against indulgences, and everything happened remarkably quickly. He exhibited these 95 theses, and I've showed you first one edition, and then this is another. Oh, this is the bad one, I think. Yes, that's right. You see, they only get to 87, not 95. That's because they repeat the numbers up here. It was done in such a hurry that they didn't even number it correctly. And next on, this is the pamphlet version, and one more please, that's the cover, and then this is the inside. And you can see that, generally speaking, they're not numbered 1 to 95, they're 25, and then they start again in 325s. And it's really this pamphlet version which makes Luther a famous figure. Now, because the theses had had this much publicity, his opponents had to respond, and they did so in January 1518 at a meeting of the Dominicans. Now, Luther was an Augustinian friar, so this took on the man who was preaching the indulgence for the church was a Dominican. So this took both sides tended to support their own team. The Dominicans piled in behind Tetzel, the Augustinians behind Luther. And this was the 106 theses they published in response to his 95. These documents are incredibly rare, by the way. This is the only surviving copy. And we know that at least 600 were published because they were brought to Wittenberg, intercepted by some students who burnt the lot. So this is a solitary survivor. And of the copies of Luther's broadsheet theses, no more than 2 survive of each of the Leipzig and Nuremberg editions, and the original Wittenberg edition has been lost altogether. So he was forced to respond to this, and what he did then was the radical point of the Reformation. Because this exchange of theses is not radical. Luther's a professor. One of the things we professors do is we provide things for debate. That's absolutely standard. It's in Latin, and the principle of theses is you can put them forward and then repudiate them if someone persuades you otherwise. They're meant for debate. But what he did next is truly radical, and that is he published his next work in German, and this is in many ways the start of the Reformation, 1518, because this is the point when Luther steps outside the conversation with other academics. This sermon on indulgence and grace is the truly radical document of the Reformation, because in this, Luther is not writing for fellow clergymen, he's not writing for fellow academics, he's writing for the people he preaches to in the Wittenberg church every week. And he distills into this document the theory of his criticism of indulgences in 20 short paragraphs. Now the word short is critical to Luther's appeal, and it's a revolution in writing. The thing I had to do at the Morgan was about Luther and social media, and drawing some comparisons. And one of the things that Luther grasped instinctively was the importance of brevity. And that was substantially new. Medieval argumentation is all about pounding your opponent with repetition and recapitulation and long arguments and a huge number of instances. And even they use the word sermon is probably a private joke, because sermons lasted 2 or 3 hours. They were endurance tests. Remember, you're always standing up to listen to a sermon. There's no sitting down in medieval Europe. And it is therefore a form of penance to go listen to a sermon. Not like today in this church. On we go. Now, this is where the Reformation goes viral, because there are 10 editions of this published in the first year. And it goes around all the major publication places of Germany: Leipzig, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Strasbourg, Basel. And by that, it enters the bloodstream of German society. And this sets a pattern that continues for almost all of Luther's works in these first few years. The first edition in Wittenberg, immediately reprinted elsewhere, and in 10 or 12 editions. And of the, now I have to remember, of the, I think, 38 works he publishes in the first 2 years, more than half of them are 8 pages long or fewer. This can be read or read aloud in 10 minutes. It fits perfectly into a pamphlet, 8-page pamphlet. And one of the things that Luther turns out to be instinctively great at is writing to length. He writes for the right length for the publishers. But here we have the problem of Wittenberg coming up again, because there's so much interest in Luther that he has to write and write, and Rau Grunenberg, the one and only printer, cannot keep up. Just flip back a moment, because I want to get visually the difference between this. This is printed in Basel, and you see nice border, nice black border, rather beautiful script. And next one, and this is Rau Grunenberg and Wittenberg, and you see he still hasn't really changed. The world is moving on, but he's still in the 1470s. And this is Luther's confrontation with Cajetan in Augsburg in 1518. On we go. And this is a work by, this is my very, very favourite. This is a work by Andreas Karlstadt, one of Luther's Wittenberg colleagues. And you would want to put the person who put this together through a breathalyzer test. I mean, the way the text is aligned, it is just a simply hopeless piece of work. No decoration. He had very limited range of typefaces, and it was becoming clear. Not only could he not keep up, he was incredibly slow. But if this is the best that Wittenberg could do, it sort of looks provincial. and it doesn't really match up to what Luther was saying. So he had to do something about it. And one of the things about Luther is he's an incredibly practical guy. He did something about it himself. On we go. So what he did was he sought out a guy who would bring better quality to Wittenberg. And this was a man called Melchior Lothar, who was a Leipzig printer, who actually was one of Leipzig's most experienced printers, but actually a great servant of the Catholic Church. So this was a very pragmatic alliance. Luther wanted the printing quality, Lothar wanted the money, so they came to a deal. In June 1519, this man, Lothar, came to Wittenberg to see Luther, and he made a pitch for the work. He brought some examples of the sort of work he could do. And he said, if I open a shop here, I'll bring you the quality of Basel. I'll bring you the quality of John Froben, who was the prettiest, fanciest printer in the great city of Basel. And Luther thought this was tremendous. So if we go to the next, you'll see this is Lothar. And what he did is he couldn't come because he was too well established in Leipzig, but he sent his son to set up a branch office in Wittenberg. And if you go on one, you'll see, I should have put these on the same slide actually, on we go. This is the son's stuff. And if you just toggle back and forth a little, you can see that they're very, very similar in design. And this is, on we go now. And then leave it there. So this is the new shop coming to Wittenberg, and far, far more sophisticated, far better aligned, use of borders. So things are looking up. But this is good, but as you see, it's essentially importing the style of Leipzig into Wittenberg. There's nothing particularly Wittenbergy about this. What they had to do was use their best latent asset. If you go on, and it's a man called Lucas Cranach. Now, Lucas Cranach was the court painter in Wittenberg. He was also one of the great painters of the German Renaissance. He's best known to us now for his paintings of Martin Luther. He created the iconic series of images. If we just go on one, there it is, that Luther and his wife Katharina, who he married in 1525. But in fact, what we should be celebrating is the extraordinary contribution to the printing industry. If you move on. What Cranach did was he put himself in his workshop, which is a huge sort of factory, to how to give the Wittenberg pamphlets a magnificent appearance. And what he did is he designed these series of beautiful woodcut borders, hollowed out into the middle, and in the middle you place the text. And this is one of his earliest efforts. Now, in terms of quality, this is completely different from anything we've seen before. Now, if you remember those Leipzig books which we had borders, they tended to be made up of 4 separate panels. This is a single integrated design which flows around the page. And you can see how light it is. Those other borders I showed were very black and tend to take attention away from the writing. This just gives it a sort of a canopy of beauty, but doesn't actually take away the attention from the key issue, which is the work by Martin Luther. On we go. And with these works by Cranach, they were solving the problem of how to make the most of their 2 most marketable elements, which are the name Martin Luther and the place Wittenberg. And what they begin to do is they begin to understand that to do this you have to separate them out physically. The most important thing of this design is not the writing but the white space, the space between them. It's quite funny actually when you see the first Luther works. The normal pattern was to just bury the author's name right in the middle of the text, and sometimes it's sort of Ma there and Tin there, or Lu there and there, Th there. But now they're getting the point. Go on. There's a very good example. Again, a beautiful piece by Lucas Cranach, and then Dr. Martinus Luther Wittenberg. Now you have to remember that when you're buying books, you would be buying them normally from a stall where they're laid out in a great profusion. And remember also that most people in the period have uncorrected sight. I mean, it's very interesting, if you look at that without your glasses on, that's a very interesting test for its success, because I can just about make out Luther and Wittenberg even like that. And lastly, in this little sequence, we have this. And this is Brand Luther. This is what gave me the title of the book. Martinus Luther Wittenberg. Now, the success of this can be actually demonstrated very effectively by the number of occasions on which these designs were counterfeited by printers elsewhere. One of my postgraduate students is doing a study of this for his PhD, and he's been going around Germany and he's found hundreds of examples. If you go on to the next one, this is an Augsburg counterfeit, and next one, here is the original Wittenberg and the counterfeit on the same page. You can see exactly the same design, but significant differences. If you see the leaves that are present there and absent there. Now this must have been, very difficult for Cranach, because his intellectual property was at stake. But it was very good for the Reformation, because this sort of branding had effectively given the Reformation pamphlet a very special appearance, which was immediately associated with Luther's message and Luther personally. Well, let's move on from this. This is what's happening in Wittenberg is a microcosm of what's going on elsewhere in Germany. After the early years of bankruptcy and failure, this is recreating an industry, and that's for two reasons. The problem of books is the investment time between starting the process of printing and being able to make sale. I often think it's rather like a golf course, that by the first time you put a plough through the field, it's usually about 18 months, 2 years before anyone pays to hit a ball on the course. And so you've got to get lots of investment capital. Well, if you've got a 1,000-page book, it's rather the same, because you can't sell a single copy until you've finished the last sheet. And you've got to buy the paper, you've got to pay the wages. Then you've got to find your audience, which might be spread all around Europe. And that's why it needs major merchants involved who can borrow the money and do the investing. For these little things, these are 8 pages long. They take 2 days to make, and the audience is local. So, in no time at all, you've got a return on your capital. And that's a much easier proposition. And this allows print to be established or re-established in lots of places which until this point had not sustained a printing industry. Now, this is Luther's achievement, and one thing that's not really recognised is how personally he was involved in all this. People, when they're writing about Luther, make far too little of his background. His father was a copper miner, so he knew lots about the industry, extractive industry. He knew lots about the danger and risk of industrial investment. And he was very much involved in this new industry of printing. Now, most of that is lost to history, because most of his interventions in the printing press would have been by word of mouth. He just have wandered into the printer's workshop, had a look at the proofs, said what he thought, and wandered out again. Because authors normally had to proofread their own stuff, and you did it one sheet at a time those days rather than one book at a time. But we do occasionally get a glimpse into what Luther thought about all of this. If you go on, when he leaves Wittenberg, as he had to in 1520 when he was put in protective custody in the Wartburg castle, and no one knew he was there. No, the secret slipped out because he kept on writing to Wittenberg with his instructions. Now, I'm going to read you an extended quote from his correspondence, writing to his friend George Spalatin, and it's all about printing, and this is what he had to say. I have received the second and third set of printed sheets of the book On Confession from you. So basically they were sending the sheets, the 50 miles to where he was, and he was sending them back, corrected. I cannot say how unhappy and disgusted I am with the printing. I wish I had sent nothing in German. It is printed so poorly, so carelessly and confusedly, to say nothing of the bad typefaces and paper. John the printer, this is Rau Grunenberg, John the printer is always the same old John and does not improve. For goodness sake, under no circumstances let him print any of the German apostles. What I have sent of them should be stored away, or rather returned to me, so that I may send it somewhere else. Now that's a very big threat, because he's saying he's going to send it out of Wittenberg altogether, if they don't shape up. Therefore I am sending you nothing now, although I have finished almost 10 large manuscript sheets. I shall send nothing more until I've seen that these sordid money grubbers in printing books care less for their profits than for the benefit of the reader. Well, he wasn't very well when he was here, and he was very cranky, but ominously for Rau Grunenberg, he then goes on in this same letter to praise another work printed by Melchior Lothar, the boy who'd come over. Now, on we go. This is, by the way, what they show you as his study in the Wartburg, if you go and visit. It's a very nice, very beautiful place. On again. This is Coburg Castle. Now, by 1530, he was an outlaw, so he couldn't go to the meeting of the Diet in Augsburg. So he went halfway and sort of holed up here. Now, things have moved on, and it's not George Spalatin who's getting instructions from him anymore. It's his wife, Katharina, who is a very strong woman, very powerful businesswoman. And so he writes back to her, and if he doesn't like it, he tells her always to go into the print shop, remove the manuscript, and take them to another print shop. Because by this point, Wittenberg has 5 separate print shops. Now, to some extent, Luther is all puff and wind on this, because he actually employs all 5 of the printers. He knows he doesn't want to have a favourite printer. He doesn't want to make one person have all the profit. He wants to sustain the industry, and the best way to do that is to spread his works among all of the 5 printers. Now, as a result of this, Wittenberg's publishers became some of the city's richest inhabitants. Can you go on? This is the street now. This is the main street of Wittenberg. So, have any of you been to Wittenberg? It's one of the great visits in Europe, wouldn't you say? It's incredibly atmospheric. And you can go and you can do yourself the walk from where he lived in the Augustinian cloister to the castle church at the other end of town, where he posted the 95 Theses. And halfway up is the Golden Eagle, Gunnar Adler, a lovely coaching inn, which was founded, I think, in 1522 as a result of all the visitors. But I've often speculated what might have happened if it had been there in 1517 and he'd sat down for a drink and thought, oh well, doesn't seem so bad after all, and then just gone home. But I mean, it is very beautiful. This is one of the Cranach's residences. This is one of the Cranach houses there. And you see there's no dirty streets built in wood anymore. The whole city has been rebuilt as a result of the profit brought by Martin Luther. So the publishers have to put up with a tongue lashing every so often, but they've made a lot of money. And this explains one remarkable conversation in the summer of 1539. Around the end of June of that year, the printers of Wittenberg approached Luther with an extraordinary proposition, that if he would guarantee them first access to all his manuscripts, first use of all their books, they would give him an additional annual income of 400 guilders. Now his salary was 200. So they were offering him to triple his income, to have a guarantee of what he was giving them anyway. An extraordinary testament to what Luther was worth to the industry. Now Luther refused. He preferred to make no money from his books. He never made a penny from writing, despite the fact that he was Europe's principal author, because he didn't want to give a stick for his enemies to beat him. As it happened, he didn't really need the money anyway, because his wife ran a market garden, she took fees from the students, and she ran a brewery. So she had already ensured him a very comfortable living. But the fact that they offered this is quite extraordinary. Now Luther dies in 1546, so if any of us are around in whatever it is, 30 years' time, there's another big shindig coming then as well, I imagine, 2046. But by that time the city had been reborn like this. Luther was not only the Reformation's inspirational leader, he was also the major driver of the local economy. And by the time of his death, if you just go on one more, the print industry, which previously could barely manage these little pamphlets, could produce great things like the complete German Bible, which came out in 1534, an enormous financial undertaking, over 1,000 pages long, produced in massive editions. So to sum up what I'm saying today, I think I'm telling you that Luther is a remarkable man in so many ways, and one of those ways is his practical business sense. Not only is he an inspirational writer, but he knows that he's writing for a business, and he knows how to stimulate the business. I think I'm telling you too that the success of Wittenberg defied all the natural geography of print. That is, that print can only succeed in big cities with major capital investment. And Luther's movement was transformative not only for this small town in northeastern Germany, poised on the very edge of civilization, but for Germany as a whole. The new genre invented by Luther, the small pamphlet or Flugschrift, led the industry towards a new market, new readers. What it had done is it brought buyers into the market who had never previously owned books. And not only did they buy one of Luther's books, they bought many of them. We know that because that's how they've survived, bound together in volumes today. Now, the fires of the Reformation didn't last forever. The controversy cooled, and so the printers have got to find other ways of keeping these new readers buying. And if you move on, one of the ways they did it was to develop the market for news. This is a news pamphlet, and you can see it looks actually remarkably like one of the Luther Flugschriften. This is from 1557, and it has the title Neue Zeitung, Zeitung being the German word for newspaper now. And we move on from this to, in the 17th century, the first newspapers. These came along in the first half of the first years of the 17th century. And I've shown you this to demonstrate that in this way the new energies and markets unlocked by Luther's movement were maintained this connection with a newly engaged reading public. And I think this heritage of a mass readership, a mass market, is another part of his extraordinary engagement with printing and his extraordinary legacy to European civilization. Thanks very much.